The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the small apartment where Zora Williams and her mother lived. Zora sat at their tiny kitchen table, textbooks spread out as she tried to focus on her homework. But her mind kept drifting to the music she heard in her head, her fingers tapping out invisible melodies on the table's worn surface. "Zora, honey, did you iron your white shirt?" her mother called from the bedroom. "We need to leave in an hour." Zora sighed, closing her math book. "Yes, Mom, it's ready." Her mother, Denise, appeared in the doorway already dressed in her catering uniform, crisp black pants and a white button-up shirt. For 10 years, Denise had worked for Elite Catering, serving at the fanciest parties in town to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. "I know you don't want to come tonight," Denise said, her eyes soft with understanding. "But Mrs. Chen caught the flu and I need the help." "They're paying extra." "It's fine," Zora said, though it wasn't. She had planned to go to the community center to practice piano. The old upright there was out of tune, but it was still better than nothing. "Which rich family is it this time?" "The Montgomerys," her mother replied, adjusting her collar in the small mirror hanging by the door. "It's some charity thing for the arts?" Zora had never met the Montgomerys, but everyone in town knew who they were. They owned half the buildings downtown and had their name on the Performing Arts Center and the new wing of the hospital. An hour later, Zora stood beside her mother outside the wrought iron gates of the Montgomery mansion. The house was more like a castle, with its stone walls and perfectly trimmed hedges. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, dropping off guests in expensive clothes who laughed too loudly at things that weren't funny. "Remember," her mother whispered, as they walked through the service entrance at the back of the house. "Keep your head down, be polite, and don't touch anything unless you're cleaning it up." The kitchen was chaos, staff rushing around preparing tiny food that would barely feed a child. Zora was given a black apron and a tray of something called crostini, which just looked like fancy toast to her. "Smile," the head caterer instructed her. "But not too much. These people don't want to know you exist." For the next hour, Zora moved through the crowded rooms like a ghost, offering food that people took without looking at her. The women dripped with jewels that could probably pay for her college education. The men spoke loudly about stocks and business deals. None of it meant anything to her, until she saw it. In the corner of the main ballroom, slightly away from the crowd, stood a grand piano. Not just any piano, a gleaming black Steinway concert grand that caught the light from the crystal chandeliers above. Zora had only seen pianos like this in videos online, where famous musicians played at Carnegie Hall or Lincoln Center. Something tugged at her heart. Her fingers itched to touch those keys. "Keep moving," another server whispered as he passed by, noticing her stare. "That thing probably costs more than we'll make in our lifetimes." Zora nodded and continued offering her tray to guests who barely noticed her. But her eyes kept drifting back to the piano. Between serving rounds, she overheard snippets of conversation about the Montgomery's son taking lessons, but having no real talent, despite the fortune spent on the best teachers. As the evening wore on, the guests moved to another room where some famous string quartet was performing. Zora's tray was empty, and the head caterer told her to take a 15-minute break before helping with dessert service. Most of the staff headed outside for fresh air, but Zora found herself alone in the ballroom with the piano. The room was empty now, the guests all gathered elsewhere. The only sound was the distant murmur of conversations and the faint music from the quartet. She looked around. No one was watching. Slowly, as if approaching a wild animal, she walked toward the piano. The closer she got, the faster her heart beat. She had been playing since she was 6 years old, teaching herself on an old keyboard her mother had found at a yard sale. When that broke, she started using the community center piano whenever she could. She watched tutorials online, borrowed books from the library, and practiced fingering techniques on tabletops when no piano was available. Music was the one thing that made sense to her, the one thing that made her feel like more than just a poor kid from the East Side. Standing before the magnificent instrument now, she felt both drawn to it and afraid of it. Afraid of wanting something she could never have. Just one touch, she thought, just to know what it feels like. Zora reached out and gently pressed one key so softly that it made no sound. The key felt different from any she had touched before, smooth and responsive with just the right amount of resistance. She withdrew her hand quickly and glanced around the empty room. No one had seen, no harm done. But now that she had touched one key, the pull was even stronger. What would it sound like? How would it feel to play even a few notes on a real concert grand? Before she could stop herself, she slid onto the bench. It was like sitting on a cloud compared to the hard wooden stool at the community center. She positioned her hands above the keys but didn't press them. She just imagined the music, her fingers hovering centimeters above the ivory. She closed her eyes and pictured herself playing, hearing the music in her mind. Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor, her favorite piece. She had spent countless hours practicing it, section by section on whatever piano she could access. She knew every note, every dynamic marking, though she had never been able to play it on an instrument worthy of the composition. "What do you think you're doing?" The sharp voice cut through the room like glass. Zora's eyes snapped open and her hands jerked away from the keys as if they'd been burned. Standing in the doorway was a boy about her age, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her mother's monthly rent. Behind him were 3 other teens, all looking at her with a mixture of shock and amusement. "I asked you a question," the boy said, walking toward her. "What are you doing touching my piano?" Zora stood quickly, almost knocking over the bench. "I'm sorry. I wasn't." "You weren't what?" "Playing it. Just about to?" His voice was getting louder, drawing attention from people passing by the doorway. "Do you have any idea how much this costs?" Zora felt her cheeks burning with shame. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor. "I'm sorry," she repeated, backing away. "I was just looking at it. I didn't play anything." "Looking doesn't require sitting on the bench," one of the other teens said with a snicker. More people were gathering now, drawn by the commotion. Among them was an older man with the same sharp features as the boy, clearly his father. "What's happening here, Preston?" the man asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "One of the servers was touching the Steinway, Dad," Preston said, pointing at Zora as if she were a criminal. She was sitting on the bench about to play it. All eyes turned to Zora, who wished more than anything that her mother would appear and rescue her. But Denise was probably in the kitchen, unaware of what was happening. "Is that true, young lady?" Mr. Montgomery asked, his expression stern but not unkind. "Yes, sir," Zora admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm very sorry. I just wanted to see what it felt like. I didn't play anything, I promise." "She plays piano, Dad," Preston said with an eye roll. "As if a server knows how to play a Steinway." Whispers rippled through the growing crowd. Zora felt sick to her stomach. She needed to find her mother and leave. This job was important to Denise. What if Zora had just gotten her fired? But Mr. Montgomery was studying her with curious eyes. "Do you play?" he asked. Zora hesitated, then nodded. "A little. At the community center sometimes. Nothing special?" "Nothing like this piano, that's for sure," Preston muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Something shifted in Mr. Montgomery's expression. He glanced at his son, then back at Zora. "Well," he said, gesturing toward the piano, "why don't you show us what you were going to play?" Zora's heart stopped. "Sir? If you were interested enough to sit at it, you must have had something in mind to play," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't exactly a request. "We'd like to hear it." Preston's smug smile told Zora exactly what he expected, that she would embarrass herself, proving she had no business touching such a fine instrument. The other guests were watching with thinly veiled curiosity, some already amused at the thought of a caterer's daughter attempting to play. Zora looked around for her mother, but didn't see her. There was no escape from this moment. She could either walk away in shame or face whatever came next. With trembling legs, she walked back to the piano. Zora sat down at the piano bench, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone must hear it. The beautiful Steinway gleamed under the chandelier lights, intimidating in its perfection. The room had fallen completely silent. She could feel dozens of eyes on her back waiting, some curious, others eager to see her fail. Preston stood off to the side, arms crossed, that smug smile still playing on his lips. His friends huddled nearby, phones ready, probably hoping to capture her humiliation. Mr. Montgomery watched with an unreadable expression, one eyebrow slightly raised. Zora's hands hovered above the keys. They were shaking. She had never played for an audience before, not a real one. Sometimes the janitor at the community center would stop mopping to listen, or younger kids would gather around in awe. But this was different. These people weren't here to appreciate music. They were waiting for entertainment of another kind. She closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. In her mind, she heard her mother's voice from years ago. "When you're scared, honey, just pretend you're alone in our living room. The world disappears when you play anyway." The world disappears when you play. Zora placed her fingers on the keys, feeling their cool smoothness. Then, before she could think too much about it, she began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 filled the room, soft, questioning. Like a gentle stream that knows it will eventually become a powerful river, the piano responded to her touch in a way no instrument ever had before. Each note rang clear and true, with a richness she had only imagined. For the first few measures, she was still aware of the crowd, of Preston and his father, of the weight of judgment. But then, just as her mother had said, the world began to disappear. There was only the music, flowing from her fingers as naturally as breathing. The piece built slowly, gathering momentum and complexity. Her hands moved across the keyboard with increasing confidence, finding the dynamics and emotional swells that she had always felt, but never been able to fully express on lesser instruments. When she reached the first dramatic passage, her fingers danced through the challenging runs without hesitation, years of practice guiding them. She didn't see the shock spreading across Preston's face or the way his father's mouth fell slightly open. She didn't notice the guests who had been passing by the doorway now stopping to listen, or the servers pausing with their trays. She was lost in the story that Chopin was telling through her, a story of longing, of struggle, of beauty born from pain. In the kitchen, Denise was arranging desserts when one of the other servers rushed in. "Denise, you need to come right now," the woman whispered urgently. "It's your daughter." Denise's heart dropped. "What happened? Is she okay?" "She's playing the Montgomery's piano. In front of everyone." Denise nearly dropped the tray she was holding. "She's what?" "Playing like nothing I've ever heard," the woman added, already pulling Denise toward the door. "Everyone's watching." By the time Denise reached the ballroom, the crowd had grown 3 times larger. People stood in silent amazement as Zora played the most difficult sections of the piece, her small frame swaying slightly with the music, completely unaware of the stir she was causing. Denise had always known her daughter was talented. She'd scraped together money for that yard sale keyboard. Feeling guilty it wasn't a real piano, she'd watched Zora teach herself, practicing until her fingers were sore, filling their tiny apartment with beautiful sounds. But even she had never heard Zora play like this. As the piece reached its climax, Zora's fingers flew across the keys with astonishing speed and precision. The complex chord progressions and technical passages that challenged even conservatory-trained pianists seemed to come naturally to her. The room was completely still except for the powerful music filling every corner. Among the crowd, a distinguished older man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses stood perfectly still, his eyes closed, listening with an intensity that set him apart from the other guests. Occasionally, his hand would move slightly, as if conducting certain passages. The final notes of the piece hung in the air, questioning, unresolved, then finding peace in the last gentle chords. As the sound faded, Zora's hands remained on the keys for a moment. She slowly opened her eyes, returning to reality, suddenly remembering where she was and what had happened. The silence that followed was complete. Then someone began to clap. Then another, and another. Suddenly the room erupted in applause, genuine, enthusiastic applause. People were smiling, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Zora turned on the bench, confused by the reaction. She saw her mother standing near the back of the crowd, hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She saw Preston no longer smirking but staring at her with his mouth slightly open. And she saw Mr. Montgomery clapping slowly, studying her with new interest. The silver-haired man made his way through the crowd until he stood directly in front of the piano. "Young lady," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent, "may I ask who your teacher is?" Zora swallowed hard, suddenly shy again. "I don't have one, sir." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "No teacher?" the man repeated, eyebrows raised. "Then how did you learn to play Chopin's ballad with such maturity of interpretation?" Zora glanced at her mother, who gave her an encouraging nod. "I watch videos online, and I have some books from the library. I practice at the community center when I can." The man exchanged a look with Mr. Montgomery. "And where else do you practice?" We had an old keyboard, but it broke last year, she said quietly. So mostly just tables now until I can get to the center. More murmurs, louder this time. Someone in the back whispered, "Did she say tables?" The silver-haired man turned to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, for those who don't know me, I am Dr. Julian Roberts, director of the Young Artists program at the Eastman School of Music. I have been teaching piano for 40 years, and I can tell you that what we just witnessed was extraordinary." He turned back to Zora. "Young lady, what is your name?" "Zora Williams, sir." "Well, Miss Williams, you have a remarkable gift. That piece takes most of my advanced students years to master, yet you play it with an emotional understanding that cannot be taught." Zora couldn't believe what was happening. This had to be a dream or a cruel joke. People like her didn't get moments like this. Mr. Montgomery stepped forward. "Dr. Roberts, you're saying this young woman has genuine talent." "Talent?" Dr. Roberts laughed softly. "Mr. Montgomery, what this young woman has goes beyond talent. She has that rare combination of natural ability, emotional intelligence, and clearly, despite the odds, dedication to her craft. With proper training and a decent instrument." He trailed off, shaking his head in wonder. Zora looked over at Preston, who was now staring at the floor, his friends no longer hovering around him. One of them had put their phone away, the humiliation video forgotten. "Dad," Preston said quietly, "can I talk to you for a second?" But Mr. Montgomery was already deep in conversation with Dr. Roberts, both of them occasionally glancing at Zora with expressions she couldn't quite read. Denise had made her way through the crowd and now stood beside her daughter, one hand protectively on her shoulder. "Mom, I'm sorry," Zora whispered. "I know you said not to touch anything." "Hush now," Denise said, squeezing her shoulder. "I'm not mad. She wiped a tear from her cheek. "I'm proud of you, baby." So proud. A woman in an expensive-looking blue dress approached them. "That was simply magical, dear. Have you played at any recitals?" "My daughter studies piano at the conservatory, and I've never heard her play Chopin with such feeling." Before Zora could answer, another guest joined them. "Do you know Debussy? His works would suit your style beautifully." Suddenly, people who had looked through her all evening were speaking to her directly, asking questions, offering compliments. It was overwhelming. Zora looked to her mother for help, but Denise seemed equally stunned by the turn of events. Mr. Montgomery cleared his throat loudly, and the crowd quieted. "Miss Williams, my son would like to say something to you." Preston stepped forward, no longer looking confident and superior. His cheeks were slightly flushed as he met Zora's eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, the words sounding unpracticed and genuine, "for what I said earlier. About you being, I was being a jerk." Zora nodded, not trusting herself to speak. This night had already contained too many impossible things. "The thing is," Preston continued, glancing at his father, "I've been taking lessons for 8 years, and I can't play anything close to what you just did." He shrugged, a gesture that seemed to cost him something. "So yeah, I was wrong." Dr. Roberts placed a hand on Zora's shoulder. "Miss Williams, I would very much like to speak with you and your mother about your future. A talent like yours should not go undeveloped. Would you be available to come to my office tomorrow?" Zora looked at her mother in disbelief. Denise nodded, speechless. "Yes, sir," Zora managed to say. "Thank you." As Dr. Roberts gave Denise his card, Mr. Montgomery pulled Preston aside. They spoke in hushed tones, Preston nodding occasionally, glancing back at Zora. The crowd began to disperse, the string quartet in the next room forgotten. Some guests lingered, hoping to hear Zora play again, but the head caterer appeared at Denise's elbow. "I need her back in the kitchen," he said tersely. "We're behind on dessert service," but Mr. Montgomery overheard. "No," he said firmly. "Miss Williams is now my guest, not my server. Please manage without her." The head caterer's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but he simply nodded and retreated. Zora stood by the piano, her fingertips still tingling from the keys, struggling to process everything that had just happened. One moment she had been invisible, a server girl breaking the rules. Now people were looking at her, really seeing her for the first time. And somewhere deep inside, where she had always kept her dreams safely hidden, a tiny spark of hope began to grow. The morning after the Montgomery party, Zora woke up earlier than usual. For a moment she lay still in her bed, wondering if she had dreamed the whole thing, playing the Steinway, the applause, Dr. Roberts and his business card that now sat on their kitchen counter. The apartment was quiet except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of traffic starting to build outside. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting a warm glow across her small room with its faded posters and secondhand furniture. Zora reached for her phone and found 3 missed calls from her best friend, Tanya. News traveled fast even from exclusive parties. One of the other servers must have talked. She got up quietly, trying not to wake her mother, who had worked late into the night after the event. In the kitchen, she made herself a bowl of cereal and sat at the table, staring at Dr. Roberts' card. The embossed letters felt heavy with possibility. Dr. Julian Roberts, Director, Young Artist Program, Eastman School of Music. She picked it up, turned it over in her hands. People like her didn't go to places like Eastman. That was for kids whose parents could afford years of private lessons and expensive instruments. Kids who grew up in houses with music rooms, not cramped apartments with thin walls and neighbors who complained about noise. The sound of shuffling feet made her look up. Her mother stood in the doorway, wrapped in her old bathrobe, hair tucked under a scarf. "You're up early," Denise said, moving to the coffee maker. "Couldn't sleep," Zora admitted. Denise filled the coffee maker with water and turned it on before sitting across from her daughter. "Me neither. Kept replaying it all in my head." "Do you think it's real?" Zora asked, pushing the card toward her mother. "Or is this going to be one of those things where they get my hopes up and then nothing happens?" Denise took the card, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know, baby. But Dr. Roberts seemed sincere. And the way those people looked at you when you played..." She shook her head, smiling. "That was real. No one can take that away from you." They sat in silence for a moment, the coffee maker gurgling in the background. "What time is the appointment?" Zora asked. 11, Denise said. "I already called in to work. Told them I needed a personal day." Zora's eyes widened. Her mother never took days off. Even when she had the flu last winter, she'd gone in for a catering event, afraid of losing the income. "What if nothing comes of this?" Zora whispered, giving voice to her biggest fear. Denise reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "Then we go on like before. But at least we'll know we tried." At 10:30, they left their apartment dressed in their nicest clothes. Zora in her school concert outfit, a simple black skirt and white blouse, and Denise in the dress she wore to church on special Sundays. They took the bus downtown to the address on the card, a modern building with Eastman School of Music in elegant letters above the entrance. Inside, the lobby was filled with the distant sounds of various instruments, a violin somewhere, a flute, a piano. Students walked through with instrument cases, some laughing, others looking intensely focused. Zora tried not to stare, but she couldn't help it. This was a world she had only glimpsed in videos online. The receptionist, a friendly woman with glasses, directed them to the 4th floor. "Dr. Roberts is expecting you," she said, giving Zora an encouraging smile. The elevator doors opened onto a hallway lined with photographs of musicians, some young, others clearly famous, though Zora didn't recognize them all. At the end of the hall was a door with Dr. Roberts' name on it. Denise squeezed Zora's hand. "Ready?" Zora nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Dr. Roberts' office was smaller than Zora had expected, but warm and inviting. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with scores and music theory texts. A baby grand piano stood in one corner. The window overlooked a courtyard where students sat on benches, some practicing, others just enjoying the day. Dr. Roberts rose from behind his desk when they entered. "Mrs. Williams, Miss Williams, thank you for coming. Please sit down." They sat in the 2 chairs facing his desk. Zora perched on the edge of hers, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've been thinking about your performance last night," Dr. Roberts began, looking directly at Zora. "It was quite remarkable. Tell me, how long have you been playing?" "Since I was 6, Zora replied. "My mom found a keyboard at a yard sale." "And your teachers?" Zora glanced at her mother. "Like I said last night, I don't really have any. I mean, there was Mrs. Garcia at school who let me use the music room piano sometimes during lunch. And I watch a lot of videos." Dr. Roberts leaned forward. "So you're essentially self-taught?" Zora nodded. "Even more remarkable," he murmured. He opened a drawer and pulled out some papers. "With your permission, Mrs. Williams, I'd like to give Zora a few tests today. Nothing too formal, just to assess where she is technically and what kind of training might benefit her most." Denise nodded. "Of course." And then Dr. Roberts continued, I'd like to discuss some possibilities for Zora's future. For the next hour, Dr. Roberts had Zora play scales, arpeggios, and sight-read pieces she'd never seen before. He asked her about music theory, much of which she didn't know by name but understood instinctively. He played snippets of classical pieces and asked her to identify them. Some she knew, others she didn't. Throughout it all, he took notes, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow. Zora couldn't tell if she was doing well or poorly. Her hands were sweating, and several times she made mistakes that made her wince. But Dr. Roberts never looked disappointed, just interested. Finally, he set his pencil down and turned to Denise. "Mrs. Williams, your daughter has extraordinary natural ability. Her technique has some gaps, as one would expect without formal training. But her musicality, her understanding of the emotional landscape of the pieces she plays, that's something that can't be taught." Denise smiled proudly. "She's always had a good ear." "More than good," Dr. Roberts said. "Exceptional. Which brings me to why I asked you here today." He pulled out a brochure and slid it across the desk. "Every year, the Eastman School offers a limited number of full scholarships to exceptional young musicians through our Young Artist program. The program includes weekly private lessons, music theory classes, performance opportunities, and summer intensives." Zora stared at the brochure, afraid to touch it, afraid to hope. "I would like to recommend Zora for one of these scholarships," Dr. Roberts continued. "Based on what I heard last night and what I've seen today, I believe she has the potential to become a truly outstanding pianist." Denise's hand flew to her mouth. "A full scholarship? To Eastman?" Dr. Roberts nodded. "Full tuition. The program is designed to nurture talent regardless of financial circumstances." Zora finally found her voice. "But don't you need to audition for something like that? With a committee or something?" "Normally, yes," Dr. Roberts acknowledged. "But as program director, I have the authority to grant one discretionary scholarship each year to a student of exceptional promise. I'd like to use this year's for you, Zora." The room seemed to spin around her. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. "There is one challenge," Dr. Roberts added, his expression growing serious. "While the scholarship covers tuition, you would need access to a piano for daily practice. At least 3 to 4 hours a day." The joy that had been building inside Zora deflated slightly. Their apartment was too small and the walls too thin for a piano, even if they could afford one. And the community center was only available a few hours a week. "I see," Denise said quietly. "That might be difficult for us." Dr. Roberts was about to respond when there was a knock at the door. His assistant poked her head in. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Dr. Roberts, but Mr. Montgomery is here. He says you're expecting him." Zora and her mother exchanged surprised glances. "Mr. Montgomery?" "Ah, right on time," Dr. Roberts said, rising from his chair. "Please send him in." A moment later, Mr. Montgomery entered the office. He was dressed more casually than the night before, in slacks and a button-down shirt, but still exuded the confidence of a man accustomed to wealth and influence. Behind him, looking uncomfortable and out of place, was Preston. "Mr. Montgomery, Preston, thank you for coming," Dr. Roberts said, shaking their hands. "You know Mrs. Williams and Zora from last night." Mr. Montgomery nodded at them. "Of course. Good to see you again." Preston mumbled a greeting, not quite meeting Zora's eyes. "I was just explaining to Mrs. Williams and Zora about the scholarship opportunity," Dr. Roberts said. "Excellent," Mr. Montgomery replied. "And I think I might have a solution to the practice issue you mentioned on the phone." Zora looked between the men, confused. "They had planned this meeting together?" Mr. Montgomery turned to her. "Zora, after your performance last night, I spoke with my wife and with Preston. We have a proposal for you." He glanced at his son. "Preston, would you like to explain?" Preston shuffled his feet, then finally looked up. "The piano you played last night, the Steinway, it's technically mine, but I don't use it like I should. I've been taking lessons for years because my parents wanted me to, but I don't have the talent or the passion for it." He looked at his father. "I'd rather focus on sports," Mr. Montgomery continued where his son left off. "What Preston is trying to say is that we'd like to offer you access to our piano for your practice. We're rarely in the music room during the day, and it seems a waste for such an instrument to sit unused when someone with your gift could be benefiting from it." Denise looked stunned. "You want Zora to practice at your house? Every day?" If it works with her schedule, yes, Mr. Montgomery said. We could arrange transportation if that's an issue. Zora couldn't believe what she was hearing. Practice on the Steinway? Every day? There's something else, Preston said, his voice stronger now. I talked to my friends who were there last night. We want to start a fundraiser at school to help get instruments and music lessons for kids who can't afford them. And we thought maybe, he glanced at Zora, maybe you could play at the kickoff event to show people why it matters? Zora was speechless. This was the same boy who had humiliated her just the night before, now asking for her help. Dr. Roberts smiled. It seems we have the beginnings of a plan. Zora receives a scholarship to Eastman, practices on the Montgomery's piano, and helps launch a music program for underprivileged youth. What do you think, Zora? Everyone was looking at her now, waiting for her answer. She thought about all the nights she had lain awake, fingers moving silently in the air above her as she practiced pieces she could only play properly in her dreams. She thought about the community center piano with its sticky keys and how she had been grateful even for that. And she thought about playing the Steinway last night, how it had felt like the instrument was an extension of herself, responding to her every intention, allowing her to express things she had never been able to before. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then stronger. Yes, I would like that very much. As the adults began discussing logistics, Preston moved to stand beside her. I really am sorry about last night, he said quietly. I was a jerk. Zora studied him for a moment. Why the change of heart? Preston looked embarrassed. When you played, it was like hearing music for the first time, you know? Like really hearing it, he shrugged. Made me realize some things. From across the room, Dr. Roberts called her name. Zora, shall we go to one of the practice rooms? I'd like to hear you play once more before you leave. As she stood to follow him, Zora caught her mother's eye. Denise was smiling, tears glistening in her eyes. Zora smiled back, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Sometimes life changed in an instant. Sometimes all it took was the courage to touch the keys. 6 weeks had passed since that life-changing night at the Montgomery mansion. Summer had fully arrived, bringing with it humid days and the sweet freedom from school. For most teenagers, this meant sleeping late, hanging out with friends, and forgetting about responsibilities. But Zora's life had taken a completely different turn. Every weekday morning, a sleek black car would pull up outside her apartment building at precisely 8:30. The driver, a kind man named Roy who always had a newspaper folded under his arm, would greet her with a nod as she slid into the back seat. By 9, she would be seated at the magnificent Steinway in the Montgomery's music room, her fingers dancing across the keys she once thought she'd never touch again. Today was no different. As Roy pulled into the circular driveway, Zora gathered her music books, new ones, purchased with part of the stipend that came with her Eastman scholarship. Dr. Roberts had created a structured program for her, filling in the gaps in her formal training while nurturing her natural talent. Good morning. Miss Williams? The housekeeper greeted her at the door. In the beginning, the staff had been formal and distant, unsure how to treat this girl who was neither guest nor employee. But over the weeks, they had warmed to her, sometimes pausing in their work to listen when she played particularly beautiful passages. Morning, Mrs. Chen, Zora replied with a smile. Is anyone home today? Just Preston. Mrs. Montgomery is at her charity luncheon and Mr. Montgomery is traveling for business. Zora nodded, feeling a mix of relief and disappointment. Relief because it was easier to practice when the house was empty. Disappointment because, despite everything, part of her still felt like an intruder here, still waited for the day someone would tell her it had all been a mistake. She made her way to the music room, a sun-filled space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden. The Steinway waited for her, lid raised, gleaming in the morning light. 6 weeks and the sight of it still made her heart skip. Setting her books on the stand, she began her warm-up exercises. Scales first, then arpeggios, her fingers gaining flexibility and strength with each passing day. Dr. Roberts had been impressed by how quickly she adapted to formal instruction, how eagerly she absorbed new techniques and theories. She was deep into Bach's Prelude in C major when she felt, rather than heard, someone enter the room. Looking up, she saw Preston standing awkwardly by the door, hands in his pockets. Don't stop because of me, he said. I like that one. Zora hesitated, then continued playing. Their relationship had evolved into something she couldn't quite define. Not friendship exactly, but no longer the clear division of that first night. There was an unspoken truce between them, a mutual recognition that they were both navigating unfamiliar territory. When she finished the piece, Preston came further into the room. "You make it look so easy," he said, leaning against the wall. "I used to hate practicing. My teacher would always say I wasn't trying hard enough, but..." He shrugged. "It never felt right, you know? Like trying to speak a language that just wouldn't come naturally." Zora nodded. She understood now that Preston's initial hostility had been partly born from years of feeling inadequate, of being pushed to excel at something that simply wasn't his passion. "How's the fundraiser going?" she asked, changing the subject. The kickoff event was scheduled for the following week. Preston's face brightened. "Really good, actually. We've already got commitments from most of my dad's business contacts, and the school principal is totally on board. She's going to let us use the auditorium for free." "That's great," Zora said, genuinely impressed. Preston had thrown himself into the project with unexpected enthusiasm. What had started as a vague idea had grown into a structured program with clear goals, providing instruments and lessons to kids who couldn't afford them. "My dad hired a PR team to help," Preston continued, a hint of pride in his voice. "They're calling it Music for All. Kind of basic, but it works. Oh, and guess what? They want to make you the face of the program." Zora's fingers stilled on the keys. "Me? Why?" "Because you're the whole reason it exists," Preston said, as if it were obvious. "Your story is what makes people want to donate. The self-taught pianist who just needed access to the right resources." Zora shifted uncomfortably on the bench. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight. Before that night at the party, she had spent most of her life trying not to be noticed, to blend in, to avoid drawing attention that might lead to rejection or ridicule. "I don't know if I..." "You don't have to decide right now," Preston said quickly. "Just think about it, okay? It could really help a lot of kids." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Roberts. "Running 15 minutes late for our session. Keep warming up with the Chopin we discussed." "I should get back to practicing," she told Preston. "Dr. Roberts will be here soon for our lesson." Preston nodded and turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, I almost forgot. My mom wants you to stay for dinner tonight. She's inviting Dr. Roberts, too. Something about discussing your first recital." After he left, Zora stared at the keys for a long moment. First recital. The word sent a flutter of excitement and terror through her stomach. Dr. Roberts had mentioned it before. The importance of performance experience, of learning to channel nerves into energy rather than panic. But it had seemed like a distant future thing, not something happening now. She turned to the Chopin nocturne Dr. Roberts had assigned, losing herself in its gentle, flowing melody. By the time he arrived, she was completely absorbed in the music, barely noticing when he quietly entered and took a seat nearby, listening with closed eyes. "Beautiful tone," he said when she finished. "You've been practicing." "Every day," she replied. It wasn't just the hours at the Steinway. It was the mental practice, too, lying in bed at night, running through pieces in her mind, feeling the shapes her hands would make, hearing the music in her imagination. The lesson flew by, as it always did. Dr. Roberts was a demanding teacher, but also an inspiring one. He pushed her technically while encouraging her to find her own voice in each piece. "Preston mentioned something about a recital?" she asked as they were finishing. Dr. Roberts smiled. "Ah, yes. I was going to bring that up over dinner, but since the cat's out of the bag, yes, I think it's time. Nothing too ambitious for your first public performance. Just a small audience, a few carefully chosen pieces to showcase your progress." "How small is small?" Zora asked nervously. 30, perhaps 40 people. Friends of the Montgomerys, some faculty from Eastman, a few potential donors for the scholarship program. He must have seen the panic in her eyes because he added gently, "You're ready, Zora. More than ready." That evening, Zora called her mother from the Montgomerys' kitchen phone. The dinner wouldn't end until late and she wanted to let her know. "A recital?" Denise repeated when Zora explained. "Baby, that's wonderful. When is it?" 3 weeks from now. They want to hold it here in the Montgomerys' home. "I'll request the night off right away," Denise promised. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Dinner was served in the formal dining room, a space Zora had only glimpsed before. The table could seat 20, But tonight it was just the four of them. Mrs. Montgomery at one end, Mr. Montgomery, who had returned from his trip earlier than expected, at the other, with Zora and Dr. Roberts along the sides. The conversation flowed more easily than Zora had anticipated. Mrs. Montgomery, a former dancer, shared stories of her own performance days. Mr. Montgomery discussed the progress of the Music for All program with genuine enthusiasm. And throughout it all, Dr. Roberts gently guided the talk back to Zora's upcoming recital, helping her understand what to expect. "We'll invite some press as well," Mr. Montgomery said as dessert was served. "Good publicity for the program launch." Zora nearly choked on her cake. "Press? Like newspapers?" "And local television," he confirmed. "Don't worry, we'll handle all the details. You just focus on the music." Later, as Roy drove her home, Zora leaned her head against the cool window glass, watching the city lights blur past. Her life had changed so dramatically in such a short time that sometimes it felt like she was living someone else's story. The girl who had been embarrassed for touching a piano was now preparing for a recital in a mansion, with reporters and photographers in attendance. When she arrived home, the apartment felt smaller than ever. Her mother was still at work. The late catering shift that paid extra, but meant she rarely saw Zora on weekdays. A note on the refrigerator reminded her that there was leftover pasta to heat up. Zora warmed her dinner and sat at the kitchen table, textbooks spread out around her plate. Despite the whirlwind of musical training, she couldn't neglect her regular studies. Summer school had been Dr. Roberts's idea, a way to get ahead so she'd have more flexibility for practice and performances during the regular school year. As she worked through her algebra problems, her mind kept drifting to the recital. What? Would she play? Who would be there? What if she froze or made a terrible mistake? What if everyone realized she didn't belong in their world after all? The sound of keys in the door broke through her spiraling thoughts. Her mother entered, still in her catering uniform, looking tired but smiling when she saw Zora. "Hey, baby. How was your day?" Zora got up and hugged her, breathing in the familiar scent of her mother's perfume mixed with the faint smell of the industrial kitchen. "Big," she said simply. "It was a big day." Denise laughed softly. "Seems like all your days are big days lately." They sat together at the table while Denise ate a late dinner, and Zora shared all the details about the recital plans. Her mother listened attentively, asking questions, offering reassurance when Zora's insecurities bubbled up. "You know," Denise said thoughtfully as they were cleaning up, "I've been thinking, if this music thing is really happening, and it sure looks like it is, maybe we should think about moving closer to Eastman. There's some affordable apartments in that area." Zora looked up in surprise. "Really? You'd want to move?" "If it would make things easier for you, yes." Denise squeezed her daughter's shoulder. "I've spent my whole life watching other people live their dreams. I never thought I'd get to see my child live hers." That night lying in bed, Zora played through her recital pieces in her mind. 3 weeks seemed both too far away and much too soon. But as sleep began to claim her, one thought rose above the rest. Whatever happened, she wouldn't be facing it alone. She had her mother's unwavering support, Dr. Roberts' expert guidance, and unexpectedly, the Montgomery family's resources behind her. For a girl who had spent most of her life being invisible, it was a strange new feeling to have so many people invested in her success. Strange, but not unwelcome. Tomorrow she would return to the Steinway, and each note she played would bring her one step closer to becoming the musician she was meant to be. The evening of Zora's first recital arrived with a sky full of stars and a light breeze that carried the scent of late summer flowers. Inside the Montgomery mansion, staff bustled about, arranging chairs in the grand living room where the Steinway had been moved for better acoustics. Flowers adorned every surface, their subtle fragrance filling the air. Upstairs, in a guest bedroom that had been set aside as her preparation space, Zora stood before a full-length mirror, hardly recognizing herself. The dress she wore, midnight blue with a subtle shimmer, had been a gift from Mrs. Montgomery. "Every performer needs a special outfit," she had said when presenting the box, waving away Zora's protests that it was too much. A soft knock on the door broke through her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting her mother or perhaps Mrs. Montgomery. Instead, it was Preston who entered, looking uncharacteristically formal in a suit and tie. "Wow," he said, stopping short. "You look different." Zora couldn't help but laugh. "Thanks, I think." Preston's cheeks reddened slightly. "I meant good different, like a real pianist." The comment struck her in an unexpected way. A real pianist. Was that what she was now? Sometimes it still felt like she was playing a part, waiting for someone to discover she didn't belong. "People are starting to arrive," Preston continued. "My dad says there's already a camera crew from Channel 5 setting up." Zora's stomach tightened. Despite weeks of preparation, despite Dr. Roberts' constant reassurances that she was ready, the thought of playing for an audience, a real audience with critics and cameras, made her hands shake. Preston must have noticed because he added quickly, "Hey, you've got this. You've been practicing for like 1,000,000 hours. And besides, you already won these people over once, remember?" She did remember. That night when everything changed, when she had nothing to lose because she never expected to gain anything. "It's different now," she said quietly. "Now there are expectations." Preston considered this, then shrugged. "So forget about them. Play for yourself like you did that first night. That's what made everyone stop and listen anyway." Before she could respond, there was another knock. This time it was her mother, looking beautiful in her best dress, the one she usually saved for Easter Sunday. "Baby, you look stunning," Denise said, crossing the room to adjust Zora's necklace, a simple silver pendant that had belonged to Zora's grandmother. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," Zora admitted. Denise smiled. "That's normal. But you know what? In all the years I've watched you play, on that old keyboard at the community center, even just tapping your fingers on the kitchen table, I've never once seen you make a mistake when it really mattered. That's different, Mom. That was just for fun." "And this isn't?" Denise raised an eyebrow. "The day this stops being something you love and becomes only something you do, that's when we need to rethink things." Dr. Roberts appeared in the doorway, elegant in his tuxedo. "It's time, Zora. The room is full." Downstairs, the grand living room had been transformed into an intimate concert space. Rows of chairs faced the Steinway, which gleamed under carefully positioned lights. Zora peered through a crack in the door, her heartbeat quickening at the sight of the crowd. Just as Dr. Roberts had said, there were about 40 people. The Montgomerys' friends, faculty from Eastman, music critics from local papers, and yes, a television crew setting up in the back. "Remember," Dr. Roberts whispered beside her, "take your time when you sit. Adjust the bench. Center yourself before you begin. The audience will wait." Mr. Montgomery stepped to the center of the performance area, welcoming everyone and briefly explaining the Music for All initiative. Zora only half listened, her mind running through her program, her fingers silently practicing the most challenging passages. "Discovered quite by accident," Mr. Montgomery was saying, "when a young woman with extraordinary talent found her way to our piano. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Miss Zora Williams, who will be performing for us tonight." Applause filled the room as Zora walked to the piano, conscious of every step, of the rustle of her dress, of the many eyes following her movement. She sat at the bench, adjusted it slightly, and placed her hands in her lap, taking a deep breath just as Dr. Roberts had taught her. In the front row, her mother smiled encouragingly. Next to Denise sat Mrs. Montgomery, elegant in a cream-colored suit. Preston gave her a subtle thumbs up from his seat beside his mother. Zora placed her hands on the keys. The room fell silent, that magical moment of anticipation before the first note. She had chosen to begin with Bach, the prelude in C major, that had become like a comfortable friend over the past weeks, not too challenging technically, but beautiful in its mathematical precision, a perfect way to calm her nerves before the more demanding pieces. The first notes rang out clear and true. By the eighth measure, Zora felt her anxiety beginning to fade, replaced by the familiar comfort of the music itself. This was why she played, not for applause or recognition, but for this feeling, this connection to something larger than herself. She moved through her program with growing confidence, Bach to Chopin, a nocturne that flowed like water under her fingers. Next came a Debussy piece that Dr. Roberts had recommended to showcase her sensitivity to dynamics and color. With each piece, she felt herself relaxing more, remembering Preston's advice to play for herself, to find that same freedom she had felt the first night. The cameras, the critics, the important people from Eastman, they all faded into the background. There was only the music speaking through her fingers, telling stories that words never could. For her final piece, she had chosen the Chopin Ballad No. 1 in G minor, the very piece she had played that first night when she thought no one was listening. Dr. Roberts had hesitated when she suggested it, concerned that it might be too ambitious for her first recital, but something in her insisted. This was her story, from beginning to end. As she played the opening bars, gentle and questioning, Zora caught her mother's eye. Denise was crying silently, tears tracking down her cheeks even as she smiled with fierce pride. In that moment, Zora played for her, for the woman who had worked double shifts to keep her in shoes that fit, who had found that yard sale keyboard, who had never once suggested that her daughter's dreams were too big. The piece built in intensity, growing more complex, more passionate. Zora's fingers flew across the keys with a confidence that surprised even her. When she reached the coda, that famously difficult final section that had challenged pianists for generations, she surrendered completely to the music, letting it carry her through the cascading notes and dramatic chords to the powerful conclusion. The final chord hung in the air for a breathless moment before the room erupted in applause. Zora stood, slightly dazed, and bowed as she had practiced with Dr. Roberts. The applause continued, people rising to their feet, some calling "Brava!" The intensity of their response overwhelmed her, and she found herself blinking back tears as she took a second bow. Dr. Roberts was the first to reach her, his face alight with pride. "Magnificent," he said, squeezing her hand. "Absolutely magnificent." Then her mother was there, enfolding her in a tight embrace. "That's my girl," Denise whispered fiercely. "That's my beautiful, talented girl." The next hour passed in a blur of congratulations and introductions. Music critics wanted quotes. The television reporter asked for an interview. Faculty members from Eastman spoke of her promising future and remarkable maturity of interpretation. Through it all, Zora smiled and nodded, thanked people for coming, answered questions as best she could, all while feeling slightly unreal, as if she were watching it happen to someone else. As the crowd began to thin, Mr. Montgomery called for everyone's attention. "Before you leave," he said, "I have an exciting announcement about our Music for All initiative." The room quieted, and Mr. Montgomery gestured for Zora to join him. "Thanks to the generosity of our donors, we've already raised enough funds to provide instruments and lessons for 50 children in our city's underserved communities. But tonight I'm thrilled to announce that my wife and I have decided to take this program a step further." He looked at Zora with genuine warmth. "We are establishing the Williams Montgomery Music Foundation, which will provide not only instruments and lessons but also performance opportunities, master classes, and eventually, college scholarships for talented young musicians who lack financial resources." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Zora looked at her mother, who appeared as shocked as she felt. "And," Mr. Montgomery continued, "we've purchased a building near the Eastman School that will serve as the foundation's home. It will include practice rooms, a small recital hall, and 2 apartments, one of which we hope Mrs. Williams and Zora will accept as their new residence, to eliminate the long commute to Zora's lessons." Denise's hand flew to her mouth. Zora found herself unable to speak, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gesture. "None of this would have happened without Zora," Mr. Montgomery said, addressing the crowd again. "Her talent opened our eyes to how many other young people might have similar gifts, if only given the chance to develop them." Later, after the last guest had departed and the caterers were cleaning up, Zora found a quiet moment alone with the Steinway. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, not pressing them, just feeling their smooth coolness beneath her fingertips. Preston found her there. "So," he said, leaning against the piano, "how does it feel to be a star?" Zora shook her head. "I'm not a star. I'm just a real pianist," he suggested, echoing their earlier conversation. She smiled. "Maybe, getting there anyway." "You know what's weird?" Preston said, suddenly serious. If I hadn't been such a jerk that night, none of this would have happened. You would have walked away from the piano and no one would have known what you could do. Zora considered this. I think, she said slowly, that some things are meant to be. If it hadn't happened that night, it would have happened some other way. You really believe that? I have to, she said simply. Otherwise, it's too scary to think how close I came to missing this, to never knowing what was possible. From the doorway, her mother called her name. It was time to go home, their old home for now. Soon they would move to the apartment near Eastman, beginning yet another new chapter. As Zora gathered her music, she took one last look at the room where everything had changed. 6 months ago, she had been a girl who played on tabletops, dreaming of touching a real piano. Now she was a scholarship student with a recital behind her and a foundation bearing her name. But most importantly, she had found her voice, not just in music, but in life. The girl who had been afraid to take up space, to be noticed, had discovered that being seen, truly seen, was not something to fear after all. It was, in its own way, a kind of freedom. Ready, baby? Denise asked, holding out her hand. Zora nodded, taking her mother's hand. Ready. Whatever came next, they would face it together, one note at a time.